And I still think there's a lot of confusion around the legal processes. It's not just one. It's two separate legal processes that victims and survivors sometimes have to deal with. Can you spell out the difference between the civil and the criminal?
Most victims of crime really only deal with the criminal justice system. So they go through that process where they're not really a part of the process. They're often ignored. It's really the state that carries the prosecution, and that's where it ends. In impaired driving-related crashes, because there's insurance involved, maybe third parties like restaurants or bars who might have overserved, victims and survivors are often involved in a civil process after the criminal justice process has ended. So people will file a civil suit against an insurance company, depending what province you are, against the driver's insurance company, or maybe a third party as well. And it's a very different process. The criminal justice process is led by the state. Victims and survivors aren't really even mentioned in that process. The civil law process is driven by the victim and survivor and their family. They hire their own lawyer. They initiate the process. They have much more of a say in how things proceed. It's a very long process, like the criminal process. Can be a very invasive process, but it's often a lot of confusion between the two processes that people don't really appreciate the differences, and they're really entirely different systems and how they work.
So if sentenced to prison, most impaired drivers will not serve their entire sentence. Does MADD Canada offer support to victims and survivors then dealing with parole?
In our system, we believe that it's better to release someone early with conditions, like maybe you can't drink alcohol or certain places you have to live, and the ability to bring someone back into prison if they've reoffended or if their risk increases, as opposed to waiting to the end of someone's sentence and then releasing them into the community with no controls. With impaired drivers, because often they have no criminal records, many people who go to prison for impaired driving causing death are facing their first prison sentence. So they're walking into a federal prison for the first time in their lives. They have no criminal history. And one of the things the parole board is going to look at is their risk. Are they a risk to reoffend if we release them? And for most of these people, there's no evidence that they're a high risk to reoffend. So from a perspective of the parole board, it's better to release them early with conditions and control as opposed to waiting to the end of their sentence. That's frustrating for families, though, because the harm these people cause is tremendous. They've killed somebody or they've severely injured somebody, and it's difficult to understand why somebody would be released early having caused that much harm. But the decision really is about their risk, not the harm that they've caused. The victims and survivors have rights in the parole process. They get to know when the offender is eligible to apply for parole, what kind of parole, where he or she is serving their sentence, if they're taking programs. It's a really complicated process, and we're able to provide information and support to victims and survivors trying to understand that process. Victims and survivors have the right to attend parole hearings and give impact statements. So we're able to help victims through that process as well, help them with their statements, but also, where possible, attend the parole hearings with them. It's one more way that we're able just to provide information to victims so they understand a complicated process, but also support through a really difficult process.
Complicated, difficult, and emotional and frustrating, I can imagine.
It is a frustrating system because you, from a survivor's perspective or a victim's perspective, you look at it and think the offender is getting the benefit of being released early. You don't really care about why that's happening. And so helping people understand why we make those decisions, and for victims and survivors who do attend parole hearings, understand why the parole board might make a decision it does. Even if they don't agree with those decisions, I think understanding them at least helps people process that a lot easier.